I once believed my life was a masterpiece, a portrait of success and love painted in the warm, golden hues of the Sterling family fortune. They say hindsight is 20/20, but for me, it's more like a blacklight, revealing the ugly, invisible stains on a canvas I thought was pristine. I had the perfect husband, Liam, a man whose ambition I mistook for passion, whose charisma I mistook for kindness. I saw him not as someone from a modest background, but as the missing piece my privileged world needed. I stepped back from my own company, the Sterling Group, a behemoth I helped build with my Wharton education, all to champion his rise. I poured my trust into him, into my younger sister, Chloe, who I'd protected her entire life, and into his sister, Megan. I gave them everything: access, status, and my unwavering, foolish loyalty. My home in the Hamptons wasn't just a house. It was the stage for a beautiful lie, and I was its most devoted and most blind audience member. Our world was one of effortless opulence, of charity galas where our smiles were brighter than the camera flashes, and of quiet weekends in Aspen where the crackling fire seemed to promise a lifetime of warmth. I orchestrated Liam's success, using my influence to place him in a key executive role within the family business. My father, despite his old money caution, grew to admire Liam's drive, seeing him as a worthy successor. I felt a surge of pride watching him command a boardroom, believing his victories were our victories. Even Megan, his sharp-tongued sister, seemed to soften, her resentment of our wealth dissolving into what I perceived as genuine family affection. We were a unit, a fortress, or so I told myself. Looking back, every shared laugh was a calculated move in their game. Every supportive word a carefully placed stone in the foundation of their conspiracy. They weren't building a future with me. They were building it on top of me, waiting for the right moment to crush me under its weight. The flight back from Geneva was shorter than I remembered, my mind already at our Hamptons estate, picturing the look on Liam's face. It was our 5th anniversary, and I'd cut the trip short by a full day to surprise him. In my bag was a vintage bottle of Dom Perignon, the one we'd been saving for a truly perfect moment. I let myself in through the side door, the house cloaked in an unusual, heavy silence. I expected to hear his music playing from the study or the low hum of a sports channel from the den, but there was nothing. An unsettling stillness had settled over the grand foyer, a place usually filled with life. A small, irrational flicker of anxiety sparked within me, a feeling that something was out of place in my carefully curated world. I set the champagne on the marble countertop, my plan for a romantic surprise already feeling slightly askew, the silence amplifying the sound of my own heartbeat in the cavernous space. I moved deeper into the house, my heels clicking softly against the polished oak floors. That's when I heard it, not a loud noise, but a low murmur of voices, punctuated by a familiar, throaty laugh. It was Chloe's laugh. The sound was coming from the back patio, the one overlooking the ocean. A wave of relief washed over my initial unease, replaced by a warm curiosity. Liam must have invited my sister over. Perhaps Megan was there too. A small family gathering. It was sweet, though I wondered why he hadn't mentioned it. I slowed my approach, a playful smile forming on my lips as I planned to sneak up on them. I crept past the formal dining room, the heavy drapes drawn against the afternoon sun, casting long, dramatic shadows. The voices grew clearer, a cocktail of casual confidence and shared secrets. I paused just before the French doors, peering through the sliver of glass, ready to burst out with my surprise, my heart full of love for the 3 people I trusted most in the world. The scene that met my eyes shattered my world into a million silent, glittering pieces. There they were: Liam, my husband, Chloe, my sister, and Megan, my sister-in-law, lounging on the patio furniture. In the center of the table, sweating in the afternoon heat, was my bottle of Dom Perignon, 3/4 empty. Chloe was nestled possessively against Liam's side, her hand resting high on his thigh, a gesture of such casual intimacy it stole the air from my lungs. Megan sat opposite them, a smug, triumphant smirk on her face as she swirled the champagne in her flute. They weren't having a family gathering. They were celebrating. They were toasting a victory I didn't yet understand, using the very symbol of my marriage as their communion wine. It was a tableau of betrayal so perfect, so complete, it felt like a scene ripped from a nightmare, and I was the ghost haunting the edges of my own life, invisible and utterly irrelevant. I stood frozen, hidden in the shadows, as their words drifted towards me, each one a poisoned dart. "Her father's heart can't take another shock," Liam was saying, his voice laced with a sickening, feigned concern. "We just need to gently present the evidence of her fragile emotional state. The board will have no choice but to transfer control to me." Chloe giggled, a sound that was once endearing now turned monstrous. "She'll probably thank you for taking the burden off her shoulders." My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a gasp, but in my shock, I knocked against a small side table. A porcelain vase teetered and crashed to the floor. The conversation stopped. 3 pairs of eyes swiveled towards the sound, finding me in the doorway. There was no panic in their faces, no remorse, only annoyance. It was Megan who spoke, her voice dripping with cold contempt as she looked right through me. "It's about time you found out," she sneered. "You're a dead weight on this family." That was it. That was the moment the woman I used to be died. There was no screaming, no pleading, no satisfying collapse into tears for them to witness. Their words didn't break me. They forged me. The searing pain in my chest instantly cooled, crystallizing into something hard, dense, and unbreakable. I saw the entire conspiracy laid bare, their greed, their resentment, their calculated cruelty. An emotional outburst was exactly what they wanted. The final piece of evidence for their narrative of my instability. I met Megan's hateful gaze, held it for a beat, and then, without a single word, I turned and walked away. I left the shattered vase on the floor, a fitting metaphor for my shattered life. During the long, silent drive back to the city, grief was the fuel, but resolve was the engine. They thought they were cutting off a dead weight. They had no idea they had just unleashed a leviathan. My war wouldn't be fought with tears. It would be fought with strategy, precision, and the full, crushing power of the sterling empire they so desperately craved. The drive back to Manhattan was a blur of asphalt and steel, the city lights smearing into a cold, indifferent watercolor. The initial searing pain of their betrayal didn't fade. It transmuted. It cooled, hardened, and sharpened into a weapon inside my chest. Each mile that separated me from that patio in the Hamptons was another layer of emotional armor forming around my heart. "You're a dead weight on this family." Megan's words echoed not as an insult, but as a declaration of war. They had miscalculated, profoundly. They expected tears, a hysterical breakdown, a scene that would perfectly fit their narrative of my fragile emotional state. Giving them that satisfaction would be handing them the victory. I gripped the steering wheel of the Range Rover, my Range Rover, and felt the grief recede, replaced by an unnerving, crystalline clarity. They didn't want a wife or a sister. They wanted an asset to be liquidated. Very well. I would show them what a sterling asset was truly worth. My private penthouse on the Upper East Side felt like a fortress, a sterile sanctuary far removed from the contaminated life I'd just left behind. It was a space Liam had always found intimidating, a symbol of the sterling power he could never truly possess. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, the sprawling city skyline laid out before me like a map of my own kingdom. This was the empire my grandfather built, and my father expanded. The empire they wanted to steal. A simple divorce was insufficient. Exposing their affair was petty. No, this required something more methodical, more complete. My objective solidified in that moment. As cold and hard as the glass under my fingertips, I would not just reclaim what was mine. I would systematically dismantle every pillar of their existence, their finances, their careers, their social standing, until nothing remained but the rubble of their own greed. They would be left with nothing, not even the memory of the life they thought they had secured. Before I even took off my coat, I made the first call, not to my father, whose fragile heart couldn't handle this, a fact they were counting on, but to Arthur Vance. Arthur had been my family's attorney for 40 years, a man whose loyalty was forged in steel and whose discretion was absolute. When he answered, my voice was unrecognizable even to myself. The warmth was gone, replaced by a flat, precise tone of command. "Arthur," I said, cutting through the pleasantries, "I need you to prepare a full asset lockdown on all joint accounts and trusts under my primary signature. Effective immediately." There was a brief silence on his end. "And I need the name of the best private investigator you've ever worked with. The most ruthless one." I offered no explanation, no hint of personal turmoil. This was not a cry for help. It was a mobilization order. The first chess piece was now in motion, and my opponents didn't even know the game had begun. After the call, I poured myself a single malt scotch, the amber liquid a stark contrast to the celebratory champagne they had stolen. I sat at my desk, a large mahogany piece that had belonged to my grandfather, and opened a clean, leather-bound journal. This would be my war room. On the first page, I wrote their names: Liam, Chloe, Megan. Beneath each, I began listing every single thing they owed to me, to my family name. Liam's position at the company, his Amex Black Card, his access to the corporate jet, Chloe's trust fund allowance, her seat on the charity board, her rent-free Soho loft, Megan's inclusion in our social circle, the network she leveraged for her boutique PR firm. Their entire lives were built on a foundation of my generosity. They had called me dead weight. They were about to learn that I wasn't the weight. I was the entire structure, and I was about to trigger a controlled demolition. They would feel every floor collapse beneath them. The first phase of my war was silent, swift, and entirely digital. They expected hysterics. I gave them a series of keystrokes. Before the sun rose the next day, I was on a secure line with Arthur. My voice was devoid of emotion, a sterile instrument of command. "Liquidate all access," I instructed. "Liam, Chloe, Megan, corporate accounts, personal lines of credit, access to all properties, revoke everything tied to my signature." It wasn't about the money itself. It was about severing their life support. They had built their entire existence on my infrastructure. And with a few simple commands, I was pulling the plug. They would wake up that morning as sterling beneficiaries and go to bed as nobodies, stranded on an island of their own making with no bridge back to the mainland. The first strike wasn't a cannon blast. It was the chilling silence of a terminated wire. The cancellation of Liam's Amex Black Card was a particularly satisfying move. That card wasn't just a tool for him. It was a prop, a symbol of the power he believed he had earned. I imagined the scene with cold delight. Liam at a power lunch, attempting to pay the bill with a flourish, only to have the card declined. The quiet humiliation, the stammered excuse, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere as his colleagues watched him fumble for another form of payment. It was a small, public wound, the first of many I intended to inflict. For Chloe and Megan, their supplementary cards were their entry keys to a world they felt entitled to. I pictured them at Bergdorf's or Saks, their arms laden with merchandise, only to be met with the same digital rejection. They weren't just losing purchasing power, they were being publicly demoted, their unearned status revoked in front of the very people they sought to impress. Next came the bank accounts. Arthur's team worked through the night, executing a flawless financial extraction. The joint accounts we held, which I had so generously funded, were drained to the last cent. Every dollar was legally transferred to a new, impenetrable trust under my sole control. They wouldn't just be unable to buy luxuries, they would struggle to pay for a taxi. I knew Liam's personal savings were laughable, a pittance he kept for show. He relied entirely on the steady, massive influx of my family's wealth. That morning, he would check his balance and see a string of zeros. The panic would set in then, a cold, creeping dread that had nothing to do with a broken heart and everything to do with a broken bank account. It was a beautiful, clean strike, Sai, leaving no room for argument or negotiation. They were financially neutered, and they had no idea the scalpel was wielded by me. Chloe's turn was next. My sister, who had always resented my perfect life while happily cashing the checks it provided, was about to learn the true cost of her betrayal. I instructed the family wealth manager to immediately halt her monthly trust fund allowance. This wasn't a small stipend. It was a fortune that funded her Soho loft, her designer wardrobe, and her entire social existence. The email notification she would receive would be brief, clinical, and devastating. Per the primary trustee's directive, all disbursements have been suspended indefinitely. There would be no one for her to call, no one to scream at. She had burned her only bridge. I pictured her staring at that email, the color draining from her face as she realized the golden faucet had been turned off for good. She wanted my life. She could start by learning how to pay her own rent. Finally, I reclaimed my physical spaces, the Hamptons estate, the Aspen ski chalet, the fleet of cars. They were all Sterling Group assets, privileges I had extended to them. I had the locks changed on every property by mid-morning. The security codes were wiped. The company car service was instructed to no longer accept calls from their numbers. They were, in effect, homeless and stranded. The very stages where they plotted my demise were now closed to them. Megan, who loved flaunting her weekends in the Hamptons to her less affluent friends, would find her key useless. Liam would be unable to access the garage to retrieve the Aston Martin I had gifted him for his birthday. They weren't just cut off from my money. They were exiled from my world, their names erased from the guest lists of the life they had tried to steal. The silence from their end was deafening, a testament to their shock and confusion. With their financial legs cut out from under them, it was time to attack Liam's professional standing. A direct firing would be too messy, too emotional. It would feed their narrative of my instability. Instead, I opted for a more elegant weapon, a full-scale forensic audit of his division. I used a burner phone to place a call to the Sterling Group's ethics hotline, my voice digitally altered, posing as a concerned junior analyst. I provided a few vague but tantalizing hints about inflated expense reports and questionable vendor contracts, things I had noticed months ago but dismissed out of misplaced trust. The tip was just enough to trigger the company's mandatory protocol, an emergency audit, led by a team fiercely loyal to my father, was initiated before lunch. Liam wouldn't see it as an attack from me. He would see it as a corporate nightmare, a random stroke of bad luck that had descended at the worst possible time. While the auditors began their meticulous work, I activated my next asset. Arthur had recommended a private investigator named Marcus Thorne, a man he described as a ghost with a camera. Marcus was ex-Mossad, a specialist in discreet surveillance and asset recovery. When we met in a sterile, anonymous coffee shop, I laid out my requirements with chilling precision. I didn't want just proof of the affair. That was amateur hour. I wanted everything. I wanted documentation of their financial desperation, recordings of their panicked conversations, evidence of any illegal shortcuts Liam might take to cover his tracks during the audit. I wanted to see the cracks forming in their pathetic little alliance. "I want you to build me a coffin for 3D, I told him, sliding a cashier's check across the table. "And I want it to be airtight." He simply nodded, the check disappearing into his coat without a sound. My ownership of the company afforded me certain legal privileges. With Arthur ensuring every step was compliant with corporate policy, I had the IT department install monitoring software on Liam's office computer and phone. The official reason was a system-wide security upgrade, a plausible excuse that would raise no alarms. Suddenly, I had a direct feed into their conspiracy. I became the silent observer of their unraveling. The transcripts of their text messages were a goldmine of escalating panic. Liam's initial arrogance gave way to frantic accusations. He blamed Megan for being too obvious, Chloe for being too reckless with their spending. They were turning on each other, their greed and resentment now aimed inward. They couldn't understand the source of their misfortune. Was it a competitor? A disgruntled employee? The thought that I, the dead weight, could be behind it never once crossed their minds. The first reports from Marcus were more satisfying than I could have imagined. He had captured footage of a furious argument between the three of them in a secluded corner of Central Park. Their body language was a symphony of blame and fear. Liam was pacing like a caged animal. Megan was stabbing her finger in his chest, and Chloe was weeping, not from remorse, but from the frustration of her canceled credit cards. They were trapped, flailing in the dark, and their paranoia was a beautiful thing to behold. They suspected everyone but me. Liam was convinced arrival at the company had tipped off the auditors. Megan was certain one of her PR clients had betrayed her. Chloe, in her self-absorbed world, believed a jealous friend had sabotaged her social standing. They were so blinded by their own egos, they couldn't see the architect of their ruin standing right in front of them. To accelerate their paranoia, I moved into the realm of psychological warfare. It was time to sow discord directly among them. I anonymously sent a single, exquisite gift to Chloe's loft. A Cartier love bracelet, delivered in its signature red box. It was an item she had coveted for years. There was no note, no explanation. It was a poison pill disguised as a luxury. I knew exactly what it would do. Liam, already frantic about money, would see it and immediately suspect she had another source of income, another benefactor. His trust in her would evaporate. Megan, who received nothing, would be consumed by jealousy and suspicion. Was Chloe holding out on them? Was she planning to abandon their sinking ship? The bracelet wasn't a gift. It was a carefully calibrated explosive device designed to detonate the core of their alliance. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. Marcus's next audio recording was of a screaming match inside Chloe's loft that was so intense, he could hear it from his listening post across the street. Liam's voice was raw with fury, accusing her of sleeping with someone else for money. "Who bought you this? Who are you seeing?" he roared. Megan's voice was a venomous hiss in the background, accusing Chloe of being a selfish, untrustworthy snake. Chloe's tearful denials only fueled their rage. The Cartier bracelet, a symbol of eternal love, had become a catalyst for their ultimate implosion. They were no longer a team of conspirators. They were 3 drowning rats fighting over the last piece of driftwood, and I was the storm that had wrecked their ship. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Their own inherent greed and suspicion did all the heavy lifting for me. This was also when I faced my first real challenge, the moment my plan nearly unraveled. Liam, in a fit of desperate paranoia, became convinced someone in IT was spying on him. He mentioned to Megan that he was going to hire an outside cybersecurity firm to sweep his office and devices. It was a move I hadn't anticipated. My surveillance would be discovered, and the entire operation would be compromised. For a fleeting moment, a cold spike of fear pierced my composure. This was the test. Panicking was not an option. I had to improvise, and I had to do it immediately. My victory wasn't preordained. It had to be earned, defended at every turn. This was the moment that proved I was no longer the passive wife, but a wartime general facing an unexpected enemy maneuver. I immediately called Arthur. "Liam is planning a security sweep," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "We need a counter move. Now." Within the hour, Arthur had drafted an emergency memo from the office of the CEO, my father's office. It announced a mandatory, company-wide cybersecurity overhaul in response to a credible threat against Sterling Group's intellectual property. Our internal IT team, loyal to my family, would be conducting immediate and comprehensive diagnostics on all executive hardware. My surveillance was now masked as a legitimate corporate security measure. Liam's private sweep was rendered redundant and, more importantly, would look insubordinate if he pursued it. I had not only dodged the bullet but had also used his own paranoia to tighten my grip, reinforcing my control over the corporate environment he thought he could manipulate. That close call was a valuable lesson. It sharpened my focus and eliminated any lingering complacency. My enemies were stupid and arrogant, but a cornered animal is always dangerous. They were capable of unpredictable actions born of desperation. From that point on, I built contingencies for my contingencies, mapping out their potential moves and preparing my counterattacks 3 steps in advance. The near failure didn't weaken my resolve, it forged it into something even harder. It reminded me that this was a real war, not just a game. They were fighting for money and power. I was fighting for my name, my legacy, and the reclamation of my own life. My victory had to be absolute, leaving no room for chance or error. They would not get another opportunity to catch me off guard. Their desperation soon turned ugly, just as I predicted. With their finances in ruins and Liam feeling the heat from the audit, they launched a pathetic smear campaign. Whispers began to circulate through our social circles, carefully planted by Megan and Chloe. Kate was having a breakdown. Kate was paranoid, unstable. She had locked Liam out of their home for no reason. It was their last-ditch effort to build the fragile emotional state narrative they had plotted on the patio. I listened to the reports from my few loyal friends with a detached sense of amusement. It was the predictable shrieking of the desperate. Let them talk. Let them paint their picture. It would only make my final move, my coup de grace, all the more devastating when I revealed the truth. They were unknowingly writing the first chapter of their own public obituary. Their pathetic smear campaign began as a trickle and soon became a flood. The whispers Megan and Chloe planted in our social circles metastasized, spreading through gossip columns and carefully curated blind items on Instagram. Suddenly, a prominent real estate heiress was reportedly suffering a severe mental breakdown, exhibiting paranoid delusions and erratic behavior. They painted a picture of a fragile doll, shattered by imagined slights, locking her devoted husband out of their home in a fit of baseless hysteria. I watched it all unfold from the silent sanctuary of my penthouse, not with pain, but with the detached interest of a biologist observing a petri dish of bacteria. Every lie they told was another piece of evidence, another exhibit in the case I was building against them. They thought they were isolating me, but they were merely building the walls of their own prison, brick by slanderous brick. My phone would ring with calls from concerned friends, their voices dripping with a treacly, false sympathy I could practically taste. These weren't calls of support, they were reconnaissance missions, dispatched by Megan to gauge my state of mind and gather more ammunition. I played my part flawlessly. I was confused, heartbroken, my voice trembling just enough to sound convincingly fragile. "I just don't understand," I'd whisper, feigning a vulnerability I no longer possessed. "Liam has been so distant, and now everyone is saying these awful things." I let them report back to their puppet masters that Kate Sterling was exactly where they wanted her, broken, isolated, and ripe for the picking. They were so confident in their narrative of my weakness that they never bothered to look for signs of my strength, an oversight that would prove fatal for them. Marcus, my ghost with a camera, delivered a fresh batch of intel that was pure gold. He had recordings of Chloe and Megan coaching their so-called friends over brunch at the Baccarat, their words a masterclass in malicious manipulation. "You have to emphasize how unstable she seemed," Megan's voice instructed, sharp and commanding. "Talk about how she was always so high-strung, how you worried this was coming." Chloe would chime in, her tone a sickening blend of feigned sadness and glee. "Just say you're praying for her. It makes it sound more genuine." I listened to the recordings, a cold smile playing on my lips. This wasn't just gossip. It was a coordinated conspiracy to defame. I had their playbook, their strategy, their own words condemning them. The audio files were labeled, encrypted, and added to the growing dossier I called Project Clean Slate. Their campaign of whispers was, ironically, my greatest strategic asset. By focusing all their energy on painting me as a hysterical, irrational woman, they blinded themselves to any other possibility. In their world, a woman scorned either collapses into a weeping mess or explodes in a fit of impotent rage. The concept of a quiet, methodical, and utterly ruthless counteroffensive was completely alien to them. They were so busy broadcasting my supposed meltdown to the world that they never once stopped to wonder why their credit cards had stopped working or why an army of forensic accountants had descended upon Liam's division. They saw me as the victim of their story, the tragic figure they were writing out of the script. They had no idea I was the author of their final chapter, and the ending I had planned for them was anything but tragic. As the pressure from the audit intensified, Liam's desperation escalated from slander to something far more sinister. My surveillance revealed his new, chilling strategy. He was going to have me declared mentally incompetent. I tracked his burner phone to a series of frantic calls, which led Marcus to a grimy office in a forgotten corner of the city. The name on the door belonged to a Dr. Alistair Finch, a psychiatrist whose license was hanging by a thread, a man known in certain circles for his willingness to trade diagnoses for cash. Liam wasn't seeking a medical opinion. He was commissioning a work of fiction, a weapon forged from lies, and a prescription pad designed to strip me of my rights, my freedom, and my control over the Sterling Group. This was his checkmate move, or so he believed. I watched the footage from Marcus's long lens camera, the grainy video feeling like something from a cheap spy thriller. The scene was sordid and predictable. Liam, my dashing, charismatic husband, looked small and nervous as he slid a thick manila envelope across a cluttered desk to the disheveled doctor. In return, Finch handed him a single, official-looking document. I didn't need to see the words to know what they said. Acute paranoia, borderline personality disorder, delusional ideations, all the clinical terms required to paint me as a woman unhinged, a liability whose assets and authority needed to be transferred to her stable, caring husband for her own protection. The casual evil of it took my breath away for a moment. He wasn't just trying to steal my company. He was trying to steal my very identity, to have me legally erased. A new kind of anger ignited within me then, something colder and harder than the initial fire of betrayal. The affair was a wound to my heart. The financial theft was an attack on my legacy. But this was an assault on my mind, an attempt to use the mechanisms of medicine and law to gaslight me into non-existence. It was a profound violation, so deeply misogynistic and cruel that it erased any possibility of a measured response. He had just signed his own death warrant and that of his co-conspirators. They would not just be defeated, they would be scoured from the earth, their names becoming a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties for years to come. This act had transformed my quest for revenge into a righteous crusade. There was no longer any room for mercy. My countermove was immediate and precise. I had Arthur draft an anonymous but highly detailed tip to the state medical board regarding Dr. Finch's long history of fraudulent practices. I included information about 3 other cases I had Marcus unearth, just enough to trigger a swift and aggressive investigation that would ultimately lead to the revocation of his license. This wouldn't stop Liam from using the forged report in the short term, but it would ensure that when he did, the document's source would be exposed as a discredited fraud. Simultaneously, I scheduled a comprehensive psychological evaluation with the most respected psychiatrist in New York, a woman whose integrity was beyond reproach. Liam was handing the board a lie, and I would be ready to counter it with the unimpeachable, documented truth of my own sanity. The irony was exquisite. In his ham-fisted attempt to prove me mentally unstable, Liam was forcing me to gather irrefutable proof of my soundness of mind. He was so focused on creating his fictional version of me that he never considered I would be preparing a factual rebuttal. He thought he was building a cage for me, but every lie he told, every document he forged, was another bar in the prison he was unknowingly constructing for himself. He was playing checkers, moving his pieces with aggressive, obvious intent. I was playing chess, sacrificing a pawn here and there, luring his king into a position from which there would be absolutely no escape. The board was set, and his arrogance was leading him directly into my trap. Meanwhile, the forensic audit was reaching its terrifying conclusion for Liam. I received a summons for a private meeting from Mr. Davies, the head auditor, a man whose loyalty to my father was legendary. He was a creature of pure logic and numbers, immune to charm or intimidation. In a sterile, glass-walled conference room high in Sterling Tower, he laid out the preliminary findings. The reality was far worse than I had suspected. Liam wasn't just skimming off the top. He had established a sophisticated network of shell corporations, funneling millions of dollars from Sterling Group construction projects into offshore accounts. This wasn't just embezzlement. It was a criminal enterprise operating from within my own company. The scale of his greed was breathtaking. Davies, his face a mask of grim professionalism, informed me of his legal obligation to report these findings not only to the board, but to federal authorities. The words wire fraud and money laundering hung in the air between us, heavy and cold. He also noted, with a hint of concern in his otherwise stoic voice, that Liam's behavior had become increasingly erratic and hostile. He had been trying to bully junior accountants, demanding they halt their work and attempting to block their access to key financial servers. The cornered rat was beginning to chew at the walls of its cage, and Davies was worried he was about to bite. His concern was validated sooner than either of us could have predicted. That very night, my encrypted security app sent a high-priority alert to my phone, an after-hours breach in the executive wing. I pulled up the live camera feed on my tablet, my heart beating a steady, cold rhythm. The hallway outside Liam's office was bathed in the dim, blue glow of emergency lighting. And there he was. My husband, his expensive suit rumpled, was frantically swiping his keycard, again and again, each attempt met with the small, damning red light of denial. I had revoked his access 2 weeks ago. Panic contorted his features as he began to shoulder the heavy oak door, a pathetic display of brute force against reinforced steel. He was trying to get to his computer, to the paper trails, to the evidence that would send him to prison. Failing to break in, he began to pace the corridor, a caged animal trapped in a maze of his own making. He pulled out his phone, and I watched him scream into it, his face a mask of pure fury. I signaled my IT contact, who patched me into the audio surveillance on his company phone. His voice, raw and ragged with terror, filled my ear. "They know everything, Megan," he yelled, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "The audit, it found the offshore accounts. All of it. Davies is going to the feds. He's going to bury me." The raw, undiluted panic in his voice was the sweetest music I had ever heard. This was the sound of a god realizing he was mortal, the sound of a king discovering his castle was built on sand. The next morning, the situation escalated from frantic panic to a direct physical threat. Liam, looking like he hadn't slept in days, ambushed Mr. Davies in the executive parking garage. Marcus, anticipating such a move, was already in position, capturing the entire confrontation from a discreet vantage point. The footage was chilling. Liam used his car to block Davies's vehicle, getting out and approaching him with a predatory slowness. He didn't touch him, but he didn't have to. He leaned in close, his voice a low, menacing snarl that the parabolic microphone picked up with perfect clarity. "You're a methodical man, Davies," Liam hissed. "Think methodically about your next move. This report gets buried, or you will." He had crossed the final line. This was no longer a white-collar crime. It was witness intimidation, a desperate, thuggish act that sealed his fate. This was the linchpin. The financial crimes were an attack on the company. The affair was an attack on me. But threatening a decent, loyal man like Mr. Davies, a man who had served my family for 30 years, was an unforgivable sin. It was an assault on the very soul of the Sterling Group. Liam's betrayal was no longer just personal. It was a cancer that threatened to consume the entire organization. My mission was no longer simply about revenge. It was about surgical excision. I had to cut him out, cleanly and completely, to save the legacy my grandfather had built. The video of him threatening Davies was the final, damning piece of evidence I needed to justify not just his downfall, but his complete and utter public annihilation. Just when I thought their depravity had reached its limit, Marcus uncovered their ultimate act of treason. With their Sterling-funded accounts empty and legal troubles mounting, they had resorted to the unthinkable. Liam, guided by Megan's cynical PR connections, had initiated contact with our most ruthless competitor, a rival development firm run by a corporate vulture named Julian Croft. They were so desperate for cash that they were willing to sell the family jewels to our greatest enemy. Marcus's surveillance was flawless, tracking Liam to a clandestine meeting in a private suite at a discreet downtown hotel, a place where fortunes were made and empires were betrayed. The photographs Marcus delivered were a punch to the gut, even for my hardened heart. There was Liam, my husband, handing a sleek silver USB drive to Croft's smirking lieutenant. I knew exactly what was on that drive. The complete architectural plans, bidding strategies, and proprietary material sourcing for our company's most ambitious project to date, the new Sterling Tower at Hudson Yards. It was my father's passion project, the culmination of his life's work. Liam wasn't just stealing money anymore. He was actively sabotaging the future of our company, attempting to burn my family's legacy to the ground for a quick payout. It was an act of such profound, spiteful treachery that it bordered on biblical. Their conspiracy was now complete, a perfect trifecta of betrayal. Chloe and Megan were fully complicit. Marcus's forensic accounting team traced the payment from a shell corporation controlled by Croft directly to a newly opened offshore account. The account was in Megan's name. They had planned it all, a final, desperate cash grab before the walls closed in. They were no longer just adulterers and embezzlers. They were corporate spies, traitors to the name that had given them everything. They believed this final score would give them the funds to disappear, to start a new life built on the ashes of mine. They were about to learn that there was nowhere on earth they could run where my reach couldn't find them. This act of corporate espionage solidified my resolve into something akin to diamond. It was the final justification, the moral imperative I needed. My plan was no longer about personal vengeance. It had evolved into a necessary act of preservation. I was not just reclaiming my life. I was defending my family's name, protecting our employees, and safeguarding the empire that had been entrusted to me. The dossier on my desk was no longer a tool for revenge. It was a weapon of justice. Every photograph, every audio file, every bank statement was a nail, and I was about to hammer them into their collective coffin with the full force of the Sterling Group behind me. Their greed had finally given me the perfect, righteous cause. Emboldened by the influx of illicit cash and armed with his forged psychiatric report, Liam made his final, fatal move. He successfully petitioned the board for an emergency meeting. He leveraged the whispers of my work instability that Megan and Chloe had so diligently spread, creating a sense of urgency and concern among the more gullible board members. The official notification arrived in my inbox, its subject line a masterpiece of corporate euphemism: emergency session regarding a motion of executive fitness. He was bringing the fight to me, to the heart of my family's power. He thought he was orchestrating a coup. In reality, he had just sent me a formal invitation to his own execution. A slow, cold smile spread across my face as I read the email. He had chosen the venue himself, the main boardroom on the top floor of Sterling Tower, the very room where my grandfather had once presided, where my father had built his legacy. Liam intended to desecrate that space with his lies, to use it as the stage for my public humiliation. It was a foolish, arrogant miscalculation. He saw that room as his destination, the throne he was about to claim. He failed to realize that for me, it was home turf. He wasn't walking into a boardroom. He was walking into my arena, and the lions were already waiting. The next 48 hours were a blur of focused, relentless preparation. My penthouse became a war room. Arthur, Marcus, and my loyal IT chief worked around the clock, collating every piece of evidence into a seamless, devastating multimedia presentation. We titled it Project Clean Slate. It was a chronological narrative of their conspiracy, from the overheard conversation on the patio to the final, treasonous sale of company secrets. We embedded the audio files, cued the surveillance footage, and prepared hard copies of the financial documents for every board member. There would be no room for doubt, no possibility of denial. We were preparing to deliver a kill shot to their reputations, careers, and freedom. I spent hours rehearsing my delivery, not memorizing a script, but perfecting a tone. I would not be the grieving wife or the hysterical victim they had painted me to be. I would be calm, precise, and utterly implacable. My voice would be the instrument of their destruction, each word a carefully placed charge of dynamite at the foundations of their lives. I was not there to plead my case or defend my sanity. I was there as the true leader of the Sterling Group, presenting the undeniable findings of an internal investigation into a cancer that had metastasized within our walls. This wasn't a personal drama. It was a corporate cleansing. On the morning of the meeting, I stood before the full-length mirror in my dressing room and selected my armor. Not a dress, not a soft, feminine ensemble, but a bespoke suit of sharkskin gray, tailored to perfection. The color was deliberate, cool, powerful, and unyielding. The color of polished steel. Beneath it, I wore a simple silk shell, as black as their corrupted hearts. My hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant chignon. Every element of my appearance was designed to project one thing: absolute, unshakable control. I was not the woman they had betrayed. I was the consequence of that betrayal, a force of nature they had foolishly unleashed upon themselves. As I rode the private elevator to the top floor of Sterling Tower, a profound calm settled over me. The grief, the pain, the searing agony of that day in the Hamptons, it was all gone. It had been burned away, leaving behind only a cold, clean, and exhilarating sense of purpose. They had made the critical error of underestimating their enemy, of mistaking kindness for weakness and generosity for foolishness. They had dismissed me, discarded me, labeled me as a useless appendage to their ambitions. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about the physics of power. They had called me dead weight, and today, I would be the anchor that dragged them to the bottom of the ocean. I stepped out of the elevator and walked towards the heavy oak doors of the boardroom. I could hear the low murmur of voices from within, the sound of the audience gathering for the final act of their tragicomedy. Liam would be in there, preening, confident, rehearsing his lines for my character assassination. Chloe and Megan would likely be waiting in the wings, ready to celebrate their victory. My hand rested on the cold, brass handle of the door. A final thought, clear as a diamond, crystallized in my mind. A masterpiece isn't just about what you create. It's also about what you're willing to destroy to protect it. I took a deep breath, not of nervousness, but of anticipation. It was time for the show to begin. I entered the room, and a hush fell over the assembled board members. All eyes turned to me. I saw Liam standing at the head of the long mahogany table, a look of smug triumph on his face. He faltered for a second when he saw me, my composure clearly not what he expected. He was anticipating a tear-streaked, disheveled woman, not this calm, collected executioner. I ignored him completely, my gaze sweeping over the faces of the board, my father's oldest friends and colleagues among them. I gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to Arthur, who was seated at the far end of the table. He nodded back. All the pieces were in place. I took my seat, folded my hands on the table before me, and waited for my husband to begin digging his own grave. Liam cleared his throat, regaining his composure, his arrogance flooding back in. He launched into his pre-rehearsed speech, his voice filled with a sickening, feigned concern for my well-being. He spoke of my increasingly erratic behavior, my paranoid accusations, and his deep, profound fear for my mental health. He was a consummate actor. I had to give him that. He painted a masterful portrait of a loving husband forced to take a terrible, odd, drastic step for the good of both his wife and the company she was no longer fit to serve. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions a mixture of pity and apprehension. They were buying it, for now. He then produced the forged report from Dr. Finch, presenting it as the tragic, final piece of evidence. "It is with the heaviest of hearts," he declared, his voice thick with false emotion, "that I must ask this board to grant me temporary conservatorship over Catherine's shares and remove her from her position until she is, well, again." He placed the document on the table with a flourish, a death sentence disguised as a medical diagnosis. He looked directly at me, a flicker of cruel victory in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought the story was over. He had no idea that his pathetic little monologue was merely the prologue to my masterpiece of destruction. My father, seated at my side, looked pale and shaken, the lies taking their intended toll on his fragile health. This was their endgame, to break him through me. A protective fury, colder and sharper than any I had felt before, solidified in my chest. I placed a reassuring hand on his arm, my touch steady and firm. Then, I rose to my feet. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply looked at Liam, my expression unreadable, and spoke in a voice that was calm, clear, and carried to every corner of the silent room. "Thank you, Liam, for your performance," I said, the words dripping with ice. "Now, if the board will indulge me, I have a short presentation of my own. We can call it Project Clean Slate." I pressed a small remote in my hand. The lights in the boardroom dimmed, and the massive screen behind Liam flickered to life. The title appeared in stark white letters against a black background. A collective gasp went through the room. Liam's face, projected in the dim light, went from smug triumph to pale confusion. He had no idea what was coming. The audience was seated. The curtain was up, and the slaughter was about to begin. The first slide appeared, showing a smiling photo of the three of them on the patio in the Hamptons, champagne flutes in hand, and then their own voices filled the room, captured with perfect, damning clarity. "Her father's heart can't take another shock." The final act of their lives had officially begun, directed and produced by the dead weight they thought they had cast aside. Their expressions shifted from confusion to dawning horror as the audio played. Their plot laid bare for the entire board to hear. Liam stared at the screen, then at me, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Megan and Chloe, who I knew were watching via a live feed from an adjacent office, would be feeling the floor drop out from beneath them. This wasn't a defense. It was an annihilation. I had let them build their entire case, let them climb to the highest point of their arrogance, all so I could enjoy the satisfaction of pushing them off the ledge myself. The fall would be long, and I would make sure they felt every single second of it. The first slide was a high-resolution photograph of them on the Hamptons patio, a perfect image of sun-drenched conspiracy. Then, their voices filled the cavernous, silent room. The sound quality was perfect. Every whispered word of their plot to manipulate my father, every cruel syllable about my fragile emotional state, captured for posterity. I watched Liam's face, a fascinating study in rapid decay. The smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion that quickly curdled into raw, animal panic. He looked from the screen to me, his eyes wide with the terror of a man who had just realized the ghost he was hunting was, in fact, the executioner standing behind him. The board members, who moments before had been looking at me with pity, now turned their gazes on him, their expressions hardening from concern into cold, dawning comprehension. The game had changed, and he was just now hearing the first gunshot. Next, I transitioned from personal betrayal to corporate treason. The screen shifted to a complex flowchart, a spiderweb of shell corporations and offshore accounts originating from Liam's division. "The results of the recent forensic audit," I announced, my voice even and devoid of emotion. I walked the board through the evidence of his embezzlement, displaying falsified invoices, illegal wire transfers, and inflated construction budgets that funneled millions of dollars into accounts in the Cayman Islands. Each click of my remote was another nail in his financial coffin. My father's face was grim, but the look he gave me was one of steely pride. The investors in the front row leaned forward, their faces masks of fury. I wasn't just exposing a cheating husband. I was exposing a criminal who had been systematically bleeding their investments, a parasite feeding on the company we had all built together. The presentation then escalated to the ultimate act of corporate sabotage. Marcus's surveillance photos filled the screen, crisp, undeniable images of Liam in a dimly lit hotel suite, handing over a silver USB drive to a lieutenant from our most hated competitor, Julian Croft. "On this drive," I explained, my voice cutting through the stunned silence, "were the complete proprietary plans for the Sterling Tower at Hudson Yards, my father's legacy project." A wave of audible gasps rippled through the room. This was no longer just about theft. It was about an attempt to destroy the very future of our company for a quick, desperate payout. The reporters from the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg were writing so furiously I could hear their pens scratching from across the room. Liam had committed the one unforgivable sin in their world. He had conspired with the enemy. He was no longer just a disgrace. He was a traitor. I then wove the personal and professional together, presenting the undeniable evidence of his co-conspirators. I displayed the encrypted text messages between Liam, Chloe, and Megan, their panicked conversations about the audit, their bickering over the Cartier bracelet, their vicious arguments as my silent war took its toll. I showed the wire transfer from Croft's shell company into a new account opened by Megan. I played the recordings of Megan and Chloe coaching their friends on how to spread the rumors of my instability. The board saw them for what they were, a pathetic cabal of greedy, incompetent criminals, turning on each other the moment the pressure mounted. Their grand conspiracy was revealed to be nothing more than a cheap, sordid cash grab, and their public images were incinerated before the eyes of the city's most powerful people. Chloe, my own sister, was exposed as nothing more than a petty, jealous accomplice. To seal Liam's fate as not just a criminal, but a monster, I played the footage from the executive parking garage. The entire room watched in horrified silence as my husband, the charismatic leader, transformed into a thuggish predator on screen. They saw him block Mr. Davies's car, lean in with menacing intent, and heard his voice, a low and venomous snarl, threaten a decent, loyal man half his size. "This report gets buried, or you will," his voice echoed in the pristine boardroom. That was the moment he lost every last shred of humanity in their eyes. He wasn't a flawed man who made a mistake. He was a violent bully who would threaten an elderly employee to save his own skin. I saw several board members who had known Mr. Davies for decades flinch, their faces tightening with pure, unadulterated disgust. He had not only attacked the company's finances, but its very soul. With his character thoroughly assassinated, I moved to the final, personal humiliations. A slideshow of Marcus's surveillance photos appeared, Liam and Chloe, my husband and my sister, their affair displayed in stark, irrefutable detail in various luxury hotels and secluded restaurants. I didn't linger on them. I presented them with the same detached precision as a financial report. This wasn't for my own catharsis. It was for my father. It was to show him the full, ugly truth of the daughter he had always coddled, to sever the final bond of his misplaced affection. I watched his face as a photo of them kissing appeared on screen. There was a flicker of immense pain, quickly replaced by a look of cold, hard resolve. He turned from the screen and looked at Liam, and in that single glance, my husband ceased to be his son-in-law and became something utterly disposable. For the grand finale, I dimmed the screen to black. I let the silence hang in the air for a long, pregnant moment. "There is one final exhibit," I said softly, my voice now the only sound in the room. The inciting incident for this entire corporate restructuring. I pressed the remote one last time. There was no image, only audio. Megan's voice, sharp and dripping with contempt, filled the boardroom, as clear as if she were standing right there. "It's about time you found out. You're a dead weight on this family." A beat of silence, and then the sound of Liam and Chloe's shared, dismissive laughter. The words hung in the air like a poison gas, a perfect, brutal encapsulation of their entire worldview. It was the ultimate justification, the final, damning sentence in their trial. The humiliation was absolute. The context for their every crime laid bare. I brought the lights back up. Liam was standing at the head of the table, a hollowed-out shell of a man, his face the color of ash. The entire room was staring at him, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of profound, silent contempt. I turned to the board. "I believe the motion regarding my executive fitness is no longer relevant," I stated calmly. "However, I would like to table a new motion, the immediate termination of Liam Connolly for cause and the initiation of full criminal and civil proceedings against him and his accomplices." Just as my father began to second the motion, the grand oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Two stone-faced FBI agents, accompanied by several uniformed officers, walked directly towards Liam. Arthur had made the call the moment I presented the evidence of corporate espionage. I gave my husband one last dismissive glance as they cuffed him. Checkmate. The silence that followed the click of the handcuffs was more profound than any sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a world recalibrating, of an empire righting itself. Liam didn't struggle. He just stood there, a hollowed-out man in an expensive suit, his face a canvas of utter devastation. The board members, titans of industry who had seen everything, stared at him not with anger, but with the cold, detached curiosity one might reserve for a particularly loathsome insect. My father placed his hand over mine, his grip firm and steady. He didn't look at Liam. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the reflection of a queen who had just successfully defended her throne. I hadn't just won a battle. I had ended a war with a single, decapitating strike. The dead weight had been cut loose, and the ship was already sailing on without him, lighter and faster than ever before. The story broke like a tsunami. Arthur's office strategically leaked key documents and audio clips to the press, ensuring we controlled the narrative completely. The headlines were brutal, sensational, and utterly glorious. Sterling heiress exposes husband's treasonous plot in shocking boardroom takedown. The Sterling conspiracy, sex, lies, and corporate espionage. Liam, Chloe, and Meghan weren't just disgraced. They were transformed into national villains, their faces plastered across every news channel and tabloid. Their social media accounts became digital graveyards, haunted by thousands of comments calling them parasites, traitors, and fools. I watched the public evisceration from my penthouse, not with glee, but with the detached satisfaction of a general watching a perfectly executed artillery strike. They had wanted to make me a whisper, a rumor of instability. I had made them a headline, a permanent stain on the public record. Chloe's downfall was quieter, but no less complete. She wasn't arrested that day, but her sentence was a different kind of life imprisonment. While the world watched Liam's perp walk, a courier delivered a single, thick envelope to her Soho loft. Inside was a one-page document from my father's legal team, formally disinheriting her from the Sterling family trust, effective immediately. It was followed by an eviction notice. Her name was scrubbed from every charity board, her invitations revoked, her so-called friends suddenly unavailable. She was a ghost in a city that only values visibility. The last I heard, she was working a retail job in a suburban mall, the Cartier bracelet I'd sent her likely long since pawned. She had wanted my life so badly, and in the end, she couldn't even afford to keep a cheap imitation of it. Meghan's end was far more satisfyingly public. 2 days after the board meeting, federal agents raided her boutique PR firm, carrying out box after box of evidence. Her carefully curated image as a savvy, self-made businesswoman shattered in an instant. Her clients, a roster of the city's elite, abandoned her as if she were radioactive. The charges were extensive: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, accessory to corporate espionage, money laundering. The woman who had sneered that I was a dead weight was now buried under the crushing weight of federal indictments. Her entire professional existence, built on the connections and status my name had afforded her, was reduced to a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. She was a parasite who had finally been starved of her host, left to wither and die in the harsh light of her own crimes. Liam's legal battle was a foregone conclusion. The evidence against him was an avalanche, irrefutable, overwhelming, and meticulously documented. He was facing decades in prison for a litany of federal crimes, faced with the prospect of a long, brutal trial where every sordid detail of his betrayal would be relitigated in public. He did what all cowards do. He folded. He accepted a plea bargain that sent him to a federal correctional facility for 12 years. I didn't attend the sentencing. His fate was no longer my concern. He was a problem that had been solved, an error that had been corrected. His name was a footnote in a chapter of my life that I had already torn out, burned and scattered to the wind. He was no longer my husband or my enemy. He was simply irrelevant, a ghost haunting a prison cell. In the wake of the storm, my relationship with my father was reforged. The man who had once seen me as a daughter to be protected now saw me as a peer to be respected. The plot designed to break his heart had instead revealed its strength, and my own. The stress of the betrayal was replaced by the invigorating clarity of our shared victory. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the Sterling Group, not out of weakness, but out of confidence in his successor. "The company is yours, Catherine," he told me one evening, looking out over the city from his study. "You didn't just save it. You proved you were the only one worthy of leading it." Our bond was no longer one of paternal affection, but a partnership forged in fire, an alliance of two sovereigns ruling a shared kingdom. The board's vote to install me as the permanent CEO was unanimous. Stepping into the corner office, the one that had been my grandfather's, felt less like an ascension and more like a homecoming. The vast expanse of glass overlooking the Manhattan skyline wasn't intimidating. It was a mirror, reflecting the empire I now commanded. My first week was a whirlwind of decisive action. I initiated a company-wide restructuring, promoting loyal, talented executives and surgically removing the last vestiges of Liam's corrupt influence. I personally took charge of the Hudson Yards Tower project, scrapping Liam's compromised plans and unveiling a new, more ambitious vision that electrified our investors. I wasn't just filling a role, I was claiming my birthright, and the entire industry took notice. The Sterling Group wasn't just stable, it was stronger, leaner, and more formidable than ever before. My evenings were spent in the quiet solitude of my penthouse, a fortress of steel and glass high above the city. One night, I opened the leather-bound journal that had served as my war room. On the first page, the names Liam, Chloe, and Megan were written in my elegant script. I took a thick black pen and drew a single, clean line through each of them. There was no sense of triumph, only finality. I thought of the woman I was before that day in the Hamptons, soft, trusting, and tragically naive. I didn't mourn her. Her death was a necessary sacrifice. She had to burn away so that the phoenix could rise from her ashes. I was not the woman who had been betrayed. I was the architect of my own resurrection, built from the rubble of a life I had been willing to destroy to save myself. The process of erasing them from my world was methodical and absolute. I sold the Hamptons estate, donating the entirety of the proceeds to a foundation supporting female entrepreneurs. A public statement that the stage for their betrayal would now be used to build up other women, not tear them down. The art, the jewelry, the cars, every gift I had ever given them was repossessed and liquidated. Their names were removed from family trusts, their photos deleted from digital archives. It was a complete and total erasure. I was not just removing them from my future, I was scrubbing them from my past, ensuring that history would remember them only as a brief, failed insurrection against the true and rightful queen. They had sought to replace me, and in the end, they were the ones who ceased to exist. My new philosophy was forged in the crucible of their betrayal. I learned that trust is not a blanket to be offered, but a weapon to be deployed with strategic precision. Loyalty is a currency more valuable than gold, and it must be earned, tested, and rewarded in equal measure. My kindness, once a vulnerability, was now a calculated tool of statecraft, bestowed upon those who proved their worth and withheld from those who hadn't. I was no longer the generous heiress, the accommodating wife, the protective sister. I was the monarch of my own empire, and my court was now composed of allies, not dependents. My heart was not closed, but it was now guarded by a sentinel of cold, hard experience, and the price of admission was absolute, unwavering allegiance. They had tried to build their future on top of me, to use my foundation to erect their own shabby little kingdom. They failed to understand that I was not the foundation. I was the entire skyscraper. They were nothing more than a faulty wiring job, a structural weakness that had to be ripped out to ensure the integrity of the whole. They called me dead weight, but they were the ones who were hollow, their ambitions fueled by nothing but resentment and greed. They thought they were cutting me loose to sink to the bottom. They never imagined that I was the one who controlled the tides, and that I would use their own dead weight to anchor them to the abyss forever, leaving me free to rise. I now stand in my office, the city lights spread out before me like a carpet of scattered diamonds. This skyline is not just a view. It is a testament to my family's legacy, a legacy I have secured for generations to come. My reflection in the floor-to-ceiling glass is of a woman I barely recognize, yet know better than anyone. Her eyes are not cold, but clear. Her posture is not rigid, but powerful. She is not a survivor of a tragedy. She is the victor of a war she never started, but was destined to win. I am Catherine Sterling. I am the CEO of the Sterling Group. And this is not just my city or my company. It is my empire, and my reign has just begun.